conversation that we tend to have every time we meet up. You know, you and I have very similar interests and commitments and, just faith and political commitments as well. So it's very interesting that you and I crossed paths in the city that we live in. And so, yeah, I'm really appreciative of the work that you and your family have committed yourselves to all your life. And I'm really interested in this book that you're writing. You're writing a book, and as we had discussed in previous conversations, the topics are very much aligned with the interests of what this podcast talks about. So yeah, let's go ahead and dive in. Do you want to introduce yourself real quick, and we'll dive into a little bit of some of the topics, the general themes that are coming out as you continue to write this book?
Sure. So my name is Greg Jarrell. I am a cultural organizer with QC Family Tree, which is a neighborhood nonprofit that my wife and I started in West Charlotte, where we've lived for almost 20 years now. And so my work in particular is around housing issues. So QC Family Tree is a small housing provider of below market rate housing within the context of what is now a very rapidly gentrifying neighborhood. And it's only become that recently. And I also do some work in churches especially, but also with other institutions around town, primarily white institutions, working on issues of kind of entrenched racism, helping people to identify and find actions to work against systemic racism in their context.
And as a cultural organizer, West Side Charlotte is known as a place of deep poverty. It's not where white people usually live, but you're a white settler yourself, your family is, and you all, what was it, like 2 decades ago, maybe?
Yeah.
Two decades ago, y'all decided to move to the west side of Charlotte and live and struggle with and amongst primarily Black communities. And so, as you mentioned, it was only recently, literally just a few years ago, where all of a sudden gentrification is ravaging this community in a snap, right? It's fundamentally transforming, and there's really nothing immediately that can be done as the houses continue to be flipped and the businesses continue to close down and be bought up and renovated and turned into a coffee shop or a brewery or another white institution. So do you want to say anything a little bit about that? Because
Sure, that's right. So the work that I'm doing right now, I think is trying to help trace the roots of this like sudden flow of capital into this neighborhood, which is called Enderley Park. The roots of that go way back. So we have these cycles, these patterns of investment and then disinvestment by sort of long-term disinvestment by institutions, by government, by big business, by sort of the holders of capital. And so lots and lots of neighbors here have invested their lives and invested what few resources they have into making this neighborhood sort of the brilliant place that it has been. But then this tidal wave of capital just comes rushing in. And so the real practical piece of that is that 5 years ago, we were working on starting a community land trust. We had a philanthropic investor who was helping us to access plots of land just by purchasing them for us, kind of to hold them in trust, right? And so we could buy an empty lot for $10,000 to $15,000. We could buy a dilapidated house that could then be repaired for $60,000 to $70,000. Now, the median list price of a house in this neighborhood is over $500,000, and to buy an empty lot will cost you $250,000. So the sudden rush of capital has destabilized the neighborhood, and it has been made possible by those decades of disinvestment. Right? And what happened before those decades of disinvestment was urban renewal, that sort of was another piece of the cycle, the constant cycle of displacement of people and of culture. It's so that capital can sort of move around, so that white institutions were able to sort of take what they wanted, regardless of the consequences for poor people in particular, and especially for poor Black people in this setting.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about that, right? So your book starts with what decades?
So the focus is really like 1957 to 1972, so about a
Yeah.
15-year period.
Cool. Yeah. Tell us a little bit about the context. What is, in particular, what's happening with white flight at the time? How is the area being gentrified or not gentrified? How is capital being moved in and out? And then also, I'm also curious as to how is like the working class? How is Black labor and white settler labor being moved around in relation to this neighborhood at the time?
Yep. All right. So there's a lot here, and I can get a little bogged down in the details sometimes. I've been in the stacks for too long, so cut me off if you need to.
That's cool.
So the basic story here is there are several things coming together. So there's the Southern Freedom Movement that we sometimes would call the Civil Rights Movement. There's white flight that's happening across the country, and there's urban renewal. And urban renewal, I'm speaking about in the very specific way that this was a federally funded program that offered money to cities for what they called slum clearance programs. That's contested language that has to be sort of unpacked and dissected a bit, but that was kind of what the program was popularly called. So in the context of Charlotte, you had a relatively densely built downtown and series of neighborhoods right around downtown. But the creation of expressways and the sort of advent of really entrenched car culture has taken place at this point. And so people began moving away from downtown. They sort of spurn living in more dense settings. The American dream, so-called, is transforming into this kind of white picket fence. Entertainment is not done in public on street corners and on stoops and on sidewalks, but now entertainment happens in a family room, kind of behind a fence, right? Watching television is kind of the primary way that people are entertaining themselves. And so there's this move of the commons from public spaces into highly privatized spaces. So that's one thing that's happening, and white flight really creates the architecture to make that happen. The infrastructure of white flight is built in the suburbs. So that movement is happening. At the same time, the federal government is saying, we've got all this money available, and we would love to give it to cities, provided you can show us a program where you will eliminate dilapidated areas, sort of repair them, or renew them in some way. What that program came to mean in practice was the clearance of Black neighborhoods, especially, but also poor neighborhoods of many different racial identities. And so in Charlotte, one of the primary Black neighborhood, kind of the center of culture, of Black culture, and Black business and religious practice here, was a neighborhood called Brooklyn, downtown. White folks had had their eyes on this neighborhood for a long time and had never done anything about it. But there had been sort of this series of investments by the people who lived there, by the institutions, the businesses that had been built there, church, school, funeral parlors, restaurants, dry cleaners, like everything you need to make life work was there. And also, according to the newspaper at the time, 93% of the properties were owned by landlords, people who lived on the outside of that neighborhood.
This is the 50s and 60s, correct?
So yeah, right. This is in the late 50s, and so that created sort of an opportunity where people that didn't hold title to the places where they lived had relatively little power. It was difficult to stop this kind of forward motion of this urban renewal program. And legitimately, lots of those landlords, it's not surprising, were interested only in the rent, but not in repairing the homes, keeping things in good shape, right? So there were many, many properties that were legitimately distressed. And so in that, so you sort of had these two things, white folks moving out, but also trying to reclaim in some way what they thought was theirs, which was this kind of important downtown land that they thought had a lot of potential. And so you get these two divergent streams. And so my particular interest is, how did churches kind of get wrapped up in this? The short answer is that a lot of churches were participating in white flight, and some were choosing to stay downtown, but their members were participating in white flight, and they were coming back driving back into town for Sunday morning. The First Baptist Church of Charlotte, and so there are two for any local listeners. We have two First Baptists. We have what's now called First Baptist West, which is primarily black. It was named First Baptist before the other First Baptist Church of Charlotte, which is primarily white, which is downtown. So this argument over staying downtown or joining white flight took place very publicly at First Baptist Church. It was all in the papers, the way they were arguing with one another. The bank managers who were running sort of the lay leaders of First Baptist said, all the money's going to the south suburbs. Our people are moving in that direction. This congregation needs to go to where they called it the center of town, right? This is where the center of Charlotte is moving. What they really meant is where the center of money and whiteness is moving. But that's where the center is. So let's go there. There were a handful of other leadership within the church who said, this is a First Baptist church. It belongs downtown. And they used sort of two reasons for that. One was kind of tied up with class. They said, we need to be accessible to people of every class, because this is not just a wealthy congregation. We have working class people here. We have poor people here. This church kind of has a missionary purpose to be available to people across many classes. And also, they said, the halls of power, the big business, the city hall, the county government center, all of that is right here. And we need a Baptist presence here in downtown. There already was, there was other Baptist presence. There were black Baptist churches, but sort of in the way that white people thought that day, which was one of their important blind spots. They didn't see that there was a Baptist presence downtown, right? So we need to stay downtown, they said. And so they actually had a big fight publicly in a business meeting, and people voted, and they voted to stay downtown. The short version of this story is that they still moved off of their so the most prominent address is to be downtown on Tryon Street. They were on Tryon Street. They still moved off of Tryon Street, but they moved then a couple of years later to this urban renewal area. And so you get this very interesting set of circumstances where they're not joining white flight completely, but they are taking advantage of kind of the way that people and money is being moved around geographically within the city. And so they move their institution to what's almost the geographic center of this urban renewal land, and directly next door to the city hall. And so there are all these kind of interesting symbols, ways that they sort of crystallize. This is a movement that's happening around the country. Urban renewal is happening around the country, right? This white flight is happening around the country. And here's a church that avoids white flight in geography, and yet represents everything about those kind of competing or coexisting movements of white flight on the one hand and urban renewal on the other, that is displacing black communities.
Mm. There's a lot there. This is really interesting. So, especially the part there, you have some capitalists in the church who are saying, no, let's move. There's a lot of really rapid, short, at least for now, short-term rapid growth happening on the so-called new center, right? Moving south. So
That's
let's
right.
move down there. We'll snatch a bunch of profit. We'll have higher income workers, but most importantly, higher income, more respectable petty bourgeois people like landlords, small business owners, and even like the larger capitalists who are starting up larger, more profitable industries, right? Moving south. Let's go down there because that's where God is calling us. God's calling us down there. And also, we can be white. We can wall ourselves off from black people, from any other person who lives. Who has been forced to migrate here. We can have a white society, and again, what's most important, expanding our profit. But there's this internal struggle within this white church. And some people are like, well, also, we're Christians and we do talk about the poor sometimes. So, yeah, perhaps there were some good faith Christians where they wanted, poor people and working class people and small business people and landlords to all kind of worship together, right? Let's have religious unity and let's set politics aside, of course, except for whiteness, right? We don't want too many poor people, too many black people in our community. So yeah, I think there's something interesting there. And then I don't think I've heard you talk about this before, but there was also this desire to be politically identified, to be politically seen downtown as the Baptist church. Of course, black baptism doesn't really count in this situation for these white Baptists. We are the Baptist church, and we need to have that representation in the city of Charlotte, which has historically identified itself as the New South. So I think there's a lot of interesting kind of internal struggles here along class, along racial, national oppression here. But also there was conflict like theologically as to what, the church should do. Because I'm sure all of these arguments or these debates that were happening in the newspapers and publicly, they weren't simply about, hey, let's just make the most rational capitalist explanation. Or I doubt, even though explicit like white arguments were more accepted in public newspapers at that time than today. You could. I'm sure a lot of it was coded in theological reasoning, right?
Yeah,
God
absolutely.
God
Yeah,
wants us to stay downtown for this reason, or God wants us to go to this place for this reason.
sure. So the language to move out to the suburbs really got coded in the desires for like our children to have safe places, right? So the language
Mm,
of safety comes up.
wow.
And there's a quote within I've been through thousands of church newsletters. And one of the quotes that kind of comes back occasionally is that like danger lurks at night, right, in the shadows. So there's this coded racial language that shows up. And it's safer out in the suburbs. Like we give our children this lush environment where they can grow up. Um, and so that appeal to like this idealized family life was one of the ways that white supremacy got encoded within the language. But then there are people on the other side that really have like a missionary kind of mindset. We belong downtown because we have a mission to be there, right? We are supposed to be interacting with poor people. We're supposed to be. They talk about alcoholism a lot, and this is a big debate that's happening at the time in other circles. So we need to be downtown among the drunks is one of the things that gets said in this public debate, and amongst people who don't have the right clothes is another way that it gets said. So there are all these kind of markers of class that are also being inserted into the debate. For the poor drunk, for the dirty, smelly, working class guy, right? We need to be downtown so that we can interact with those people and bring them into the church. And sort of the assumption that's made is that the professional class that we are, like that's what they need to become. Christianity, sort of a movement into like respectable capitalism.
And the discussion around prohibition, particularly within Charlotte, if I remember correctly, uh, really took off at the late 19th century. And the first division, it was basic class division among this question of basically can we shut down all the saloons, or should the masses of working people be able to access and drink as much as they want? And it was a class struggle. So first there was basically like, the richest small ruling, class people here in Charlotte. They argued for the end of alcohol because the problem was that their workers were not as effective. They
Right.
would miss work. They would be drunk, passed out. So capitalism and colonialism is creating all this alienation and this need to kind of escape life. And so, the working masses will, they'll work and then they'll get off their 12-hour shift, their 10-hour shift. Eventually, to some degree, at one point, we wanted an 8-hour day. It's kind of gone now, but the working masses would go and we would just drink, and we would just drink ourselves heavily. And of course, there are some really, really negative things that come about with alcohol and alcoholism, but they were couching it as this religious and moral thing. Look at these backward workers. Why are they not as wealthy, as powerful as we are? Why should they not be allowed to have the control and run society like we do? Well, because they're irresponsible, they're drunk, they're spiritually inept as well. But the working masses were saying, no, you can't take this away from us. So there was a serious class tension,
Yeah.
and early on it was actually obviously, of course, led by the wealthiest white capitalists here, but a very small group of black small business capital individuals also sided with those dominant white capitalists.
Right.
But it was the majority of black and white workers here who were like, hell no, you can't take away, you can't shut this down.
Sure. Yeah, and there were multiple prohibition movements from the 1870s until the issue finally got settled sort of in around 1970. Um, and so we should mention that Jeanette Greenwood has written probably one of the only books that really dives into this. It's called
Yes,
Bittersweet Legacy. It's
it's so
really
good.
terrific. Um, and so, yeah, you do another piece of the argument that came along racial lines is that large portions of the black population in the late 19th century had been enslaved, and so they recalled the day where alcohol was not accessible. The pleasures of a good drink was not accessible to them because of the brutality of slavery, right? Because they weren't allowed to make their own decisions, and so there were many within those congregations, within black churches, many black business owners, and lots of black workers who said, even if I'm not going to drink, you're not going to tell me whether I can or not. This freedom is going to be available because we remember when it wasn't available, right? So that's another way that argument gets kind of worked out publicly in the around those pieces of prohibition.
Yeah.
So one of the interesting ways that this comes back up in the 60s, the pastor at First Baptist has very little ever to say about, he has nothing to say about urban renewal and the way that that's affecting black neighborhoods around the country and in Charlotte. He has little to say about the civil rights movement and about segregation. The couple of times that he does publicly mention it, he says something like, segregation is wrong, sort of admits this. It's not good what we're doing, but he says, alcohol is the real curse. And until we solve the problem of alcohol, then we won't solve any of the issues that are brought about by segregation. So it's this great sleight of hand, right? The structural issue of segregation, of white supremacy built into the society, he says, yeah, that's probably not very good. But the individualized decision of whether people drink alcohol and how much they drink, that's the real issue, right? So it's this way of kind of distracting from the structural and sort of pointing it to this individualized set of conceptions that really serve to further the interests of moneyed white populations in particular.
And I have an assumption, but what was the kind of suggested solution to this problem of individual bad choices around alcoholism that's creating all the suffering among Black people and all the suffering among poor people?
So there's not a lot of documentation that I've read about what the solution was, except that there was a debate that went on for a decade or so here about selling liquor by the drink in restaurants and in public places. Right? So mostly it's like a moral crusade.
Yeah.
It's sort of this notion of creating like a moral panic around alcohol so that you don't have to pay attention to the real systemic moral issues of segregation and white supremacy that are happening. But there's not really a solution. They don't propose prohibition anymore, though they do say we don't want liquor sold in restaurants by the drink. You should have to go and buy it somewhere else and take it home.
Yeah, that was my guess. Is like, listen, we don't live in a settler colonial society. Capitalism is not the problem. Segregation, but also just, white supremacy as an economic and political structure. These aren't these are bad, but they're not the real problem. The problem is individual choices, and how do you address these? The reality of suffering, the reality of injustice. You convert people. You turn people into good white American Christians. That I guess that would be my assumption, is that what we need is a moral movement, a spiritual movement to transform the souls of all of these backward people and lift them up to us more successful, proper people, right? I think that's the mindset, especially when I read the Jeanette Greenwood's book, Bittersweet Legacy. That was what I was really getting, is this is about mystifying the class exploitation and class oppression. This is about mystifying the reality of colonialism internally within the U.S. That these aren't the fundamental problems that are producing all of this individual, the suffering that we experience as individuals, right? The structures aren't the problem, but Christians can kind of bring it back and say the problem is like individual souls. We need to witness. We need to convert. You were talking about missionary work, and so the missionary work really isn't about like ending the oppression from a materialist analysis, ending the exploitation, transforming society fundamentally. It's actually serving to reproduce the exploitation and oppression, even if it is good faith.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And so thus when First Baptist Church moves, they move really to the kind of the geographic center of the former Brooklyn neighborhood, and importantly, they move directly next door to City Hall. So they kind of read that within themselves as like, we're gonna, so-called speak truth to power. But the way it looks on the map is sort of like this alliance of entrenched religious power coupled with entrenched political power, right?
Absolutely. We're gonna speak truth to power. That's funny. I mean, it's tragic.
They don't say it exactly that way, but right, that is kind of the impression that they're trying to give.
Yeah,
when in reality, like these guys are running City Hall in some ways.
Yeah, it reminds me of the language today that's pretty popular among more like liberal left-leaning folks, is like we need to hold certain positions of power accountable. To me, it's like you're going to hold them accountable to do their job. They're doing their job, which is protecting capital, protecting colonial oppression of indigenous and Black and Latino and Asian peoples. So it's like holding them accountable to do what? To do their job. And it just depends on, what do you think the role of the state is? And from a Marxist perspective, we understand the state to belong to the ruling class. And so it's going to serve exploitation and serve oppression, rather than serve the masses of us who are exploited, who are oppressed, who have to wonder, wow, do I have enough money if a single disaster happens, right? What if I get fired? I could easily get fired any day, and I'm not for sure what would happen to my family. I mean, I know we would have to sell everything we have and probably move in with a friend, and just kind of get by for a little bit. I'm not for sure what would happen, but these are the kinds of questions that the majority of people have to face, as opposed to the ruling class who owns and runs the government, runs the state on a local level, on a state level, on a national level, rather than like these two parties vying for power, which is a predominant perception.
Yeah.
There's been some good stuff here, Greg, but let's go ahead and move on. And we've kind of touched on this. Before, I want to talk about the relationship between this religious identity, Christianity, and the national racial identity amongst this church in particular. I want to get your thoughts on what do you think is perhaps the primary and foundational determinative cause of the movement and displacement and the injustice that's happening here? What systems and relations do you think are pretty much at the base, the roots of this instance where in the 50s and 60s in this place called Charlotte, North Carolina, capital is being pulled here, labor is being pulled here, some communities are being completely disinvested from, and others are just being ravaged with new capital, and people are being thrown out. What do you think is at the root of this?
So the way that I'm trying to work this out is that I think there are three things that are always kind of conjoined that help to make some sense of the movement within this particular story, which I think really maps well onto the national story that we still live with. So those three things are faith, race, and place. So briefly, I think faith in this way is a particular way of a particular manner of Christianity that has been racialized, and that has, since the doctrine of discovery, concerned itself with the way that it works in place, in how it's sort of conjoined with capitalism to take the goods from a place and to make them available to the ruling powers. I'm not sure that I'm saying that well right now. I'm still trying to find exactly the right words for this. Right? But you have this particular manner of faith that is deeply rooted in colonialism. And this comes through in the documentation, in the hymns that this church sings and the scriptures that they read as they're voting to make their move from this prominent address on Tryon Street into the urban renewal land. So they sing an old conquest hymn that's called "Lead On, O King Eternal," and the last verse finishes, "The crown awaits the conquest. Lead on, O God of might." And then the scripture that they read to themselves and preach from the day that they make this vote to move is from Numbers 13. So it's the story of the conquest of Canaan by the Israelites. All right. And so faith is operating in this, but it's sort of this upside down version of faith where they read themselves into the story as the formerly enslaved people who are looking for land to settle. So now there are a lot of post-colonial readings that we would have to bring to this story. It's a lot more complex than just a landless people looking for a place to settle in, right? But that's how they read it, which is exactly upside down. These are powerful people who are taking the land of formerly enslaved people. So they read themselves upside down. So there's always this thing about faith that's undergirding our understandings of both race and place. And so those three things work together. Yep.
Wow. Yeah. And before I don't know if you wanted to go on here, but I just want to say that is clear settler colonial ideology. It is an imagination that we as settlers are the indigenous native people, right? Yes. Now, some people have explicitly argued that we literally were like here before indigenous natives here, like white people were. But even in the liberal imagination, not the right wing kind of stuff that comes up, but just the more liberal, it says no, indigenous people were here first. But also there's this assumption that, well, in many ways I am kind of indigenous. I am the native. I'm just a pioneer exploring land where no one lives, and it's just barren land, and that God has called us to move out into this new place and find a place to settle, right?
That's right. So one of the ways this comes through, these things, they just keep, like, they're all in the record. They're all in the archives. So the neighborhood where they moved was called Brooklyn by the people who lived in that neighborhood, right? And had been for 60 years, and the people there knew it as Brooklyn. But yet there is no place that I've found in their records that they ever use that word Brooklyn to name the place. And so the importance of language as a matter of power and as a matter of conquest really sort of comes through in that. They consistently call it, we're moving to the urban redevelopment area. They never call it Brooklyn. So that's another way of sort of erasing the indigeneity, I guess, of the people who were there, of the Black community that lived there, right? Yeah. Even the words they use to describe their own neighborhood get disappeared in the course of this conquest.
Wow, there aren't Black people who have been forcibly concentrated into this neighborhood called Brooklyn for the last 60 years. There's no one here. We should move there. And right. I guess so. It's kind of profitable for us. It's also strategically, like, politically helpful for us, and then socially, it puts us in a place where we can continue to grow our church, grow the reach that we have, grow the political, the social, and economic power that we have. All again, this isn't always so. It's not always sitting in on people's, like, conscious minds, right? This is deeply embedded assumptions and practices and ways of relating to others and ourselves and property that we've just been raised in under capitalism and colonialism here. But all this was couched in theological terms. The hymn of conquest that you shared was just explicitly telling. And I grew up singing the song. It went like, our God is greater, our God is stronger, our God, you are higher than any other, right? It's this obsession, this need for God, as settler colonizers, as white people, to be in a position of conquest, of power. And even folks like you and I, who we may be settlers, but we don't have much money at all. And I'm particularly working class. These kinds of theologies, these kinds of, if you don't uncover the political assumptions and ideologies beneath it, then we can start to identify with, well, man, we do support, the landlords. We do support the small, the growing business, the competition that just ravages the masses of workers. We do support the banks and lenders who, in this instance, in this story, what's happening is they've found a very, very large plot of land. They have so much money, they're going to buy the entire plot of land. They'll either develop tons of houses and community spaces and businesses themselves on that plot of land, or they'll rent it out and make money from the interest, right? So there's profit. There's profit happening down south. There's profit happening with the rising rates of property values. But part of this thing is you have to remove the Black people, because Black presence, or just literally up in people's heads, that it pulls down the property values. And so,
yeah. And that is a consistent feature. So one of the things that I've done is just to track the figures. How has urban redevelopment and the displacement of families persisted? How has the redistribution of wealth continued through that, right? And so, the original move is to take 2 full city blocks consisting of more than 50 lots and to bundle them together. Right. So now First Baptist owns 9 acres, where formerly everything was less than 1/10 of an acre. Wow. And all that gets bundled together into a large piece, right? So that creates an opportunity for parking, for one, which is so car culture, again, comes back over and over and over in this. But it's not only their parking on Sunday, it's so that they can rent parking to bankers Monday through Friday.
Wow.
So the displacement of this Black community really is to enable sort of the ease of the ruling class to show up Monday through Friday and Sunday for church as well. Right? But then if you track the increasing value of property over time, I've done this with one family in particular. And so first, the property that First Baptist owns now in inflation adjusted dollars has increased in value, the money that it's worth between 9 and 10 times over the past 50 years from the time they moved there. So the value of this one homeowner family whose ancestors had bought after being born enslaved, had bought a piece of land, a small lot, built a house, right? They're forced to leave. They buy another lot in West Charlotte about a mile from where I am now. And the value of their home has stayed constant over the course of 60 years in inflation adjusted dollars. And so another piece of what happens consistently is that land is valued as less on the market, as being worth less simply because of the presence of Black people on it. So the way that we have learned to think about place and the spaces that we occupy has been racialized to that extent that even that a place becomes instantly more valuable the more rapidly you move Black people off of it in the eyes of the market.
Absolutely.
And so that's how deeply entrenched this is.
Yeah. Great point. So we're talking about this church who's making the decision to move in light of capitalism competing for new profits constantly, and then the federal government saying, well, we want to partner with the capitalists, we want to develop certain spaces, and also we don't want to look too bad across the world during the Cold War to what we're doing to Black people here. So maybe we'll couch it as urban development, and we'll see what happens to we'll see where they move after that. So there's this there's class struggle, there's a global struggle happening right now with the Cold War. There's also internal colonization happening. And this church is making a decision, right, about where to move our property. Where are we going to worship next? How is this group's religious identity in relation to its national and racial identity? Because for me, as a revolutionary communist, we would say that the material relations are kind of at the root of it all. Colonialism and capitalism is what's producing the situation where a white church is going to bank on a property that they can collectively afford, and then a Black community is going to get thrown out and ravaged and torn apart, which is what ends up happening. But religion is a part of what we call the superstructure. It's a part of culture. It's instead of always talking in terms of exchange relations, which is kind of like at the bottom of it all, the class structure. We'll talk about God and Jesus in the Bible. And so how do you see religion, religious identity being wrapped up with the white identity, but also American identity here?
Okay, so I think the cultural identity nationally and religiously that people have developed is that there's kind of this deep fusion. To be Christian in this or to be American in the South is also to be Christian. Like those are not easily parsed from one another. And so you see in the language of the time that this effort to move out into the suburbs, into these kind of segregated, what they assume to be very safe and lush environments, is the blessing of God, right? It is sort of the way that we know that God is working on our side is because of these material improvements that we can make in our lives. And so we sort of read that back into both the American story of achievement and promise and conquering this land and sort of create, paving it to the point that it benefits us. And then telling yourself that this is we're a church doing this. This is the blessing of God. This is the way that God works in the world by benefiting us in this fashion. And with a complete and total blindness to the devastation that's being wrought on Black communities in particular in this story at the very same time that's enabling their move.
And I can imagine that there are actual rituals and actual ceremonies and services that churches, but even seminaries or other kinds of Christian institutions that will be put on when they sell or buy property, right?
Yeah.
And
So they're like groundbreaking, right? You take a shovel, and there's a story from First Baptist of like hundreds of shovels being shipped, and the children leading the groundbreaking. Like they're given these toy shovels, and they're the first ones to dig into this blank slate where there used to be a thriving neighborhood. And
wow.
it's sort of their way of laying claim to this new place. Like, this is ours now. There was nothing here. There's just this blank dirt, and now we're going to dig it up and create this new thing that's going to exist.
That imagery, that's going to haunt me, and that's a powerful imagery. I think that really speaks to how Christianity and colonialism of actual land and labor power and how it's all working right here. That's a really haunting imagery. So we talk about all these ways in which there's suffering being produced and there's kind of economic and political motives that are really moving different parts here. But progressive white Christians have long been looking for solutions to the problem of Christianity in America being deeply tied to whiteness and white supremacy. So as you've furthered your study and reflection on the subject of this book, are there popular strategies or methods of transformation amongst progressive Christians in particular, or just general, more liberal folks that you have come to see as actually insufficient and inadequate, both in like understanding the problem and then actually addressing the problem?
So this is where some of my personal story, I think this is part of what's motivating me behind the work. So, and I may speak clumsily about this because I'm still trying to figure out how it works, and I'm willing to risk that in public sometimes. So my wife and I and some friends graduated from a liberal seminary 20 years ago, and moved to this neighborhood, Enderley Park. And one of the assumptions so we were really motivated by the Catholic worker movement and witness. One of the assumptions that's been made inside of that movement, but not only inside that movement, is about proximity. So we say, if we can just get close to the problem, then we'll understand it. Like if we put ourselves in the way, then it's going to sort of magically erase all the other aspects of identity, of material relations that we have with one another. It's going to make us good solidaries within the context. And so I just think that's a really weak answer. For one, if you think back to the time of enslavement, like who was closer to the enslaved people than the overseer, right? Proximity guarantees nothing. In fact, proximity can make it a lot easier for you to participate in the oppression of your neighbor, sometimes without knowing it, sometimes fooling yourself along the way, thinking you're doing good when you're really not. And that is one of the ways that liberals in particular, I think, think, and I think I thought this as well. If we just get close to the problem, we'll be better at solving it. And what that does in some ways, I think, is to distract us from our own the ways that we are situated inside the problem that we think we want to work against, or the ways that we've not been able to identify what the real social issues that exist around us are. And so, So that issue of proximity comes up for me a lot now. And that's part of my own sort of reckoning with, hey, I moved to a black neighborhood 20 years ago. Like, I've done the best that I can. I've learned as much as I can to be in solidarity, to try to work so that my work benefits the black community that I'm in and doesn't necessarily benefit myself. And yet I exist within a structure that um, that makes it inevitable that the people around me are going to be displaced, and there's not going to be much I can do about it, for instance. So learning how to see myself within this situation and sort of combating that naive assumption about proximity is one of the important things that I'm trying to work on.
Mm. Yeah, I think there was a time where I was really wrestling with, okay, but what's the most moral place that we should move? Should we move to the poorest part of the city? Should we move to a more like not as poor part of the city? Should we move to a wealthy white suburb or a working class, or petty bourgeois white suburb? Where was the most moral place to move, to live, to kind of plant your roots on? And I think eventually I came to a place where there is no moral movement. So whether
Right. I mean, we could have made a different decision, certainly. I'm not sure if financially we practically could have, but we could have moved to the suburbs. We could have figured it out, or we could have moved sort of to the edges of one of the wealthy neighborhoods around. But that's not a healthy environment for humans to live in. And so there is kind of this way where, you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. Like, that, what you have to do is commit to the struggle in whatever place you're in, and commit to doing as little harm as you can and to finding ways to work against whatever harm you're doing by the place that you're in.
And I think that is such a foundational, powerful truth that a lot of folks are continuing to wake up to. We are damned if we do, damned if we don't, but within this particular system. And so what has to happen is we have to fundamentally transform society. And so then the question is, well, how do we fundamentally transform society? How do we stop gentrification? And some folks are like, well, let's have like a housing voucher for a few folks. Or if we rapidly develop a new community, then we need to have like a certain section, a portion of the properties being rented to black people, or certain portion of the property being rented or sold to folks at a certain rate. And these are very reformist measures. These are not addressing, these are not questioning, but why, what is capital, and why do workers relate to bosses in certain ways? What is the relationship between the rentier, the lender, the banker, and the masses of debtors? We're not asking those fundamental questions, but some folks are. And so I think that is a really, really important part for me. I also want to say that I think Christians, because we're religious people thinking religiously, theologically about our lives and our world, we tend to go towards the realm of ideas. We tend to go towards education and culture. And I'm all for, re-educating ourselves and one another. I think that's fundamental. Cultural transformation is fundamental towards actually realizing a whole new other world. But I don't think, and last night I just got off a conversation with Joe Luman about decolonizing Christianity. And I said something similar. I don't think we can decolonize Christianity. I don't think we can end white Christianity just by trying to re-educate ourselves. The problem is not that we're just not in enough classes. The problem is not like we're not just doing enough like anti-racist education. We need Christians to be participating in actual organized struggles amongst the real enemies, amongst immediately, bosses, landlords, the city councils who are who belong to the state. The state belongs to the ruling class, right? We need to be fighting cops and private police forces when they're attacking indigenous people. And we need to, or organize women, I think, on college campuses and high school campuses against patriarchal violence. So there's all these different issues that people could be organized around, and we can find those issues by actually talking to them. Last year, I spent an entire year, week in and week out, knocking on doors, talking to people on their doorstep, and they shared what they were really concerned about, what they were really anxious and stressed about. And it is those issues that I think we can develop a movement that actually materially fights, not just tries to transform our ideas. That's really important. But I think our spirits, our souls, our minds can be really transformed if we're actually practicing, if we're actually in struggles. So
Yeah. So I think this is a really important thing, and as I'm sort of trying to draw my own work to writing a conclusion to this, so the relation of both change. So I've framed the book, and the end that it's moving towards in terms of reparations. And so I think, like, I've done the math. I can tell you, and I've done the ancestral lineage. I can tell you who to write the checks to, right? And how much they should be for. So and like, not only writing the checks, but joining in the struggle of those people, sort of especially the Black-led freedom struggle that's, again, being acted out on our streets over the past 10 years, right? So getting actively involved in those material, political, economic struggles is essential. And at the same time, we have to transform the cultures of the institutions that have encouraged us to make these decisions, including our churches. And I say we as a white settler, right? So, like, we have to consider the ways that we've read the scriptures. We have to consider the hymns that we've taught ourselves that live inside of us, the songs that we sing. And if we write the checks, the reparations checks, without transforming the cultural teachings, right? It was those kids that used the shovels at the groundbreaking ceremonies. Like, that's really powerful. These legacies get passed on. So if we don't transform the culture, then any check, whatever checks, whatever kind of political wins will be temporary, because we won't have fundamentally shifted the way that we are inside the stories. And so I think it's got to be both of those things. The good news, I think, is that if you get in the streets, if you get in the spaces where people are organizing, who are building this struggle, then that does begin to shift. It does begin to change you culturally, and it allows you to begin changing your own family and your own institutions that you're a part of culturally. So that's really essential work. But to think of it as culture as well, like, we've got to actively make those sorts of changes, because otherwise we just fall back on what's been so deeply ingrained in us.
Yeah, I'm absolutely with you. I think both material and cultural transformation is inseparable. I do want to bring up something, and we can either wrap it up here, or I want you to have the last word. So you said that you're gonna couch basically the end of your book around reparations. And from a revolutionary communist perspective, or a historical materialist perspective, a Marxist analysis, we are all for reparations. Reparations it's like a given. It's like, of course, we do need to actually right the wrongs. But one of my concerns, I think, with the pretty popular, even among, like, Democrats right now, Democrats, liberals, there's a lot of pro-reparation talk. And so I'm wondering, do you think reparations is a solution to the problem? Or how do you think they relate to a solution? What do you think?
I feel like this is a little bit of precarious territory, but I'm going to jump in anyway.
Oh yeah. This is off the hook, yeah.
So, for one, I think that settling the debts that we, and by we I mean white settlers have accumulated. My mentor, Ched Myers, has taught me to think about these in terms of hauntings, like to heal the hauntings that we have created in this society. We have to make repairs. So white people aren't at the center of that struggle to make repairs, but I think that we also have to consider what kind of people we have to become in order to make repairs and to stop the ongoing harm that capitalism is doing, the way that capitalism is destroying the world and the people in it, and it's destroying us as well as white settlers, right? Though in ways that are sometimes harder to recognize. So I think if we did these first steps, we did the work internally that we would need to do to make ourselves willing and joyful payers of these reparations, and to commit to stopping the culture that has continued to over and over and over to propagate the same story, right? I mean, the story of urban renewal is just a continuation of the story of settler colonialism from the time of the doctrine of discovery. So if we could commit to seeing ourselves in that story and to changing the way that we're going to act, then I think that opens up a world of possibility for changing material relations altogether. But to me, like, that's enough. I don't want to aim too small, but I think that's enough of a thing to bite off, that if we're talking about transforming a 600-year-old problem, or maybe something that's even older than that, like, that's a legacy for us to work on right now that is achievable. That's difficult, right? But achievable, something we can do that then our children can further and their children can further beyond us.
Yeah, hearing you share that makes me think, like, I guess for me, where I'm at is reparation acts are more transformative for the person who's doing the act, like the white person, the white community, than it really is for the suffering, the injustice, the oppression and exploitation of the person that we're, like, partnering with, the
Yeah,
indigenous
and
black.
so I think it's important because of that. Like, individual families don't write reparations checks, right? Reparations is fundamentally about changing the set of systemic relationships that we have along race, class lines. But individuals do act within those systems, and so for us to take responsibility as actors within that, I think that is the kind of work that we need to do. And that will necessarily sometimes include symbolic actions. Symbolic actions are important. They're not meaningless, even though they don't solve necessarily a whole host of social issues.
And that's where I think I still would, I'd probably want to, like, push back and disagree in that my fear is that reparations can't actually bring about systemic change at all. They could potentially make some, like, moderate, small reforms. I think the DSA is trying to do that. The DSA is trying to, like, build through the Democratic Party and become a progressive nation where we can modify the system rather than fundamentally transform it, right? You can't vote your way out of settler colonialism historically, and you can't vote your way out of capitalist relations historically. But so that's what my saying is, like, dude, if working class people, white and black and Latin and Asian and indigenous, if we want to make real reparations for Africans here, for indigenous people, that's going to take the working black, indigenous, white, and Asian, African masses to actually be in political power. So reparations is, that's why I guess for me it makes more sense to say it's more transformative. It's more like, or reorienting for us as white people to kind of do those acts, to say, wow, I have to give myself, but to really understand that from a Marxist perspective, reparations won't transform the system, Black people will always be subordinated, oppressed, colonized here. Indigenous lands and bodies will always, forever be colonized here until they've seized political power. And as long as they're not in political power, as long as the working class, myself included, as long as we are not in political power, there will be no reparations that fundamentally address or let alone end the systems that are producing the situation where a white church is like, hey, should we move south or should we move north? That's my take, and I'll let you have the last word.
Yeah, I think we're basically in line with one another here. I think that right now I'm thinking about the steps along the way, and I'm thinking about how I am in this story. So I've read a couple of times as I've been writing. I've read Beloved, probably the greatest American novel, and it's just an incredible piece of art. And there's a character in there that doesn't get a name. He's a school teacher. He's a white man, and part of the way I've been challenged in sort of some secondary literature alongside that novel is learning how I am in this story, and being willing to join in the struggle to do the work that I can participate as a full human in the struggle for freedom, in the struggle for liberation. And so, history is a part of that. The history tells us where we are now. By understanding the history, we sort of learn, here's who we are. And then having made that judgment, having been able to see ourselves clearly, like, here's who we need to become so that we can be worthy of joining in a liberation struggle for all people across the world that fundamentally changes the way our societies work.